fist of wind slammed the ranch house shutters so hard that Amos Deverell came up out of his chair with his rifle already in hand before he understood the sound hadn't been a gunshot. He crossed to the window through the dim firelight, expecting nothing but the usual howling dark of a cross-timbers blizzard, and instead found, in the brief silver flash of lightning-white snow glow, the shape of a woman collapsed against his porch post, a bundle clutched to her chest. He was out the door before he had time to think better of it, the cold cutting through his shirt like a blade, and dropped to his knees beside her in the drifting snow. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Sarah Pruitt heard the voice as though it came from the bottom of a well, distant and strange, and fought to make her eyes open. Her arms had gone past aching into a kind of numb terror, because the only thought her frozen mind could hold onto was that she must not, whatever else happened, let go of the bundle wrapped inside her shawl. "My baby," she managed, through lips too stiff to properly shape the words. "Please." "Not me, my baby." "I've got you both," Amos said, and there was no question in his voice, only the flat certainty of a man already deciding what came next. He gathered her up against his chest, baby and all, and she was shocked at how little she weighed, how thin the winter coat was beneath his hands, how she trembled even in unconsciousness with a violence that frightened him more than any blizzard ever had. He carried her through his own front door and laid her before the hearth, and only then, working with fingers gone clumsy from cold and fear both, did he peel back the frost-stiffened shawl to find a baby girl inside, blue-lipped but breathing, no more than 4 or 5 months old. "Lord above," he said softly, and for one unsteady moment the old grief rose in him, so fast it stole his breath. Another child, another hearth, another winter that had once ended very differently. He pushed the thought down hard, the way he'd learnt over 6 long years alone on this land, and set to building up the fire until the room blazed with heat, and wrapped the baby in the warmest blanket he owned, and chafed the mother's hands and feet with a desperation that surprised him. She did not wake fully until near dawn, and when she did, she came up out of sleep with a cry, reaching blindly for the baby until her hand found the small warm weight beside her on the hearth rug, and she went limp with relief. "She's fed and dry," Amos said from the chair he had not left all night. "Goat's milk, since I've no cow, but she took it well enough." "What's her name?" "Grace," Sarah said, her voice raw. "My husband picked it before he passed. He said we'd need all the grace we could get, trying to reach my sister's place out past the territory line. And you nearly didn't make it here," Amos said. "It was not quite a question. Our wagon broke an axle 2 days back," Sarah said. "I thought I could walk to the next town before the storm caught us proper. I misjudged it badly." She looked at him then, really looked, taking in the size of him, the guarded, weathered face. The rifle still leaned by the door, as though old habit hadn't yet let him trust the night was truly done. "I don't know your name, sir, or how to thank you for what you did." "Amos Deverell," he said. "And you don't thank a man for doing the only decent thing there was to do." He said it gruffly, almost sharply, and rose to check the fire rather than meet her eyes, and Sarah understood. Without quite knowing how, that kindness did not come easily to this man, or perhaps only that had cost him something once, and he had not yet decided whether he wished to risk it costing him again. "You ought to be resting," Amos said the second morning, finding her already up and trying, with unsteady hands, to heat water for washing. "You near died 2 nights past. I've a baby to keep clean and fed," Sarah said. "Resting's a luxury I gave up the day my husband passed, and left me to manage alone." Something crossed his face at that, quick and complicated, and he took the kettle from her hands without asking leave and set it himself over the fire. "Then let a man who's got nothing pressing do the lifting, at least, while you see to the parts only a mother can." It was not quite an apology, but it was, Sarah understood, as close as this careful man came to one, and she let him have his way rather than argue over so small a kindness. She stayed the week at his gruff insistence, until the roads were passable and Grace had color back fully in her cheeks, and in that week Sarah watched Amos Deverell in the particular way a woman watches a man she is trying to understand. He said little over supper, ate quickly, retreated early to whatever chores the barn offered even in bitter cold, as if the house itself, once it held voices in it again, was more than he knew how to bear. But she noticed, too, the small unguarded moments, how his hands went gentle and sure when he held Grace so Sarah could eat a meal without juggling the baby, how he had, without a single word about it, mended the sole of Sarah's worn boot one night while she slept, leaving it by the hearth for her to find. "You had a family once," she said to him one evening, when the baby had finally settled and the fire had burned low enough that the silence between them felt less like a wall than an invitation. "I don't ask to pry. Only I see the shape of it in you." Amos was quiet a long while, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "A wife," he said finally. "Martha, and a boy not yet 2. Fever took them both the same winter, 6 years back, in this same house. I couldn't get a doctor through the snow in time. I've told myself since that a man who couldn't save his own family oughtn't go looking to build another one, and mostly I've believed it." "That's a hard thing to carry alone," Sarah said softly. "Alone's been simpler," Amos said. "Simpler don't always mean better. I've had 6 years to notice the difference, and precious little I've done about it." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that held more than he seemed to know how to say aloud. "This house has had more laughing in it this week than the whole 6 years put together, ma'am, little as your girl's old enough yet to properly laugh." The roads cleared enough by the following week for Sarah to consider moving on, and it was Amos himself, gruffly, awkwardly, who raised the notion that she might not need to. "Your sister's place is 3 hard weeks off even in good weather," he said, not quite looking at her, mending a bit of harness that did not, in truth, need mending. "I've got room here. Work enough too, if you're willing. I could use hands in the kitchen garden come spring, and there's mending piles up something fierce since, he cleared his throat. "I'm not asking anything improper of you, understand? Only that you needn't risk the road again with a baby, not when there's a roof here already warm." Sarah studied him, this careful, guarded man who had carried her in from a blizzard, and then spent a week finding every quiet way possible to be kind without once calling attention to it. "I'd be grateful for that, Mr. Deverell," she said. "More grateful than I know how to properly say." So she stayed, through the last hard weeks of winter and into the slow green thaw of spring, and the ranch that had stood silent and grieving for 6 years began, day by small day, to fill again with the ordinary noise of a home Grace's babbling laughter as she learned to crawl across sun-warmed floorboards, Sarah's voice humming over the washtub, the particular contented quiet of a man no longer eating his supper alone. Amos found himself lingering at the table after meals when once he'd have been out the door to the barn within minutes. He found himself watching for Sarah's laugh the way another man might watch for rain after a long drought, and found, too, with something like fear and something like wonder both, that a second grief had begun quietly making room for a second chance. He built a cradle that spring, working at it quietly in the barn on evenings when he thought Sarah wasn't watching, sanding the wood smooth with the same careful patience he gave to everything that mattered to him. When he finally carried it into the house and set it by the hearth without a word of explanation, Sarah had to turn away to hide how completely it undid her, this gruff man's silent declaration made in planed pine and careful joints instead of speech. "It isn't much," Amos said, mistaking her silence for disappointment, gruff again in the way he grew gruff whenever he'd shown more of himself than he meant to. "It's the finest thing anyone's ever made for us," Sarah said, and watched the color rise faintly beneath his weathered collar, and understood that this careful, wounded man had no better way of saying he loved them both than to build, with his own 2 hands, the very thing a father builds for a child he means to keep. They fell into an easy rhythm as the weeks passed, Sarah's cooking filling the kitchen with smells the house hadn't known in years, Amos teaching her, patient and unhurried, the particular rhythms of ranch life she'd never learned growing up in a river town far to the east. In the evenings, once Grace down, they took to sitting on the porch where he had first found her, watching the sun drop behind the timber line, saying little, needing to say little, the silence between them grown comfortable in a way that surprised them both. It was Sarah who noticed first that something was wrong with Grace in the early days of a late-season storm that swept down out of the mountains without warning, dropping the temperature 40 degrees inside a single afternoon. The baby had been fussy through supper, and by nightfall her small body burned with fever, her breath coming in short, frightened rasps that turned Sarah's blood to ice far colder than any blizzard had managed. "Amos," she said, and something in her voice brought him across the room at a run. "She's burning up. I don't know what's wrong." He laid his rough hand against the baby's forehead and felt the truth of it immediately, and for one terrible instant the old grief rose up whole and complete, Martha's fevered face superimposed over this small one. The same helpless horror of watching something precious slip away while the storm outside made rescue impossible. He forced the memory down with a violence that left him shaking. "I'll ride for Doc Fenwick," he said. "In this storm you'll die on the road," Sarah said, catching his arm, her own fear plain and raw. "I won't lose you both. I've ridden worse," Amos said, though they both knew it for the kind of lie a person tells to make leaving possible. "I let a doctor come too late once before, Sarah. I'll not make that mistake twice, not while I've got legs to carry me and a horse in the barn." He gripped her hand once hard, searching her face as though memorizing it against whatever night might bring. "Keep her warm. Keep her fed if she'll take it. I'll bring him back or die trying, and I mean that for a promise, not a figure of speech." He was gone before she could argue further, out into a dark so thick and white it swallowed the lantern light whole within a dozen strides of the porch. And Sarah stood in the open doorway until the cold forced her back inside, straining her ears for the sound of hoofbeats long after there was nothing left to hear but wind. The 3 hours that followed were the longest of Sarah's life. She sat before the fire with Grace, wrapped close, sponging the baby's burning skin with cool water, praying in the plain, desperate words of a woman who has already buried one person she loved and cannot bear to bury another, listening to the wind scream against the shutters and imagining, over and over, Amos lost somewhere in that howling white dark, paying for his kindness to her with his very life. When the door finally crashed open near midnight, admitting a blast of snow and 2 half-frozen figures, Sarah wept aloud with a relief so total it nearly buckled her knees. Doc Fenwick, an older man made of leather and stubbornness, was already shrugging out of his coat before the door had fully shut behind him. "Croup like as not, from the sound of that cove," he said, kneeling by the baby with brisk, practiced hands but not past helping if we act quick. "Get me steam, Mrs. Pruett, boiling water and a blanket to tent it." They worked through the rest of the night, the 3 of them, coaxing Grace's breathing to ease beneath clouds of medicinal steam, taking turns holding the small trembling body upright so the vapor could do its slow, patient work. Sarah watched Amos's hands, so steady and sure with the baby, and thought of everything he must have felt doing this same desperate work once before, for a son he had not been able to save, and loved him fiercely in that moment for doing it again anyway. For a child that was not his own by blood but had become, somewhere in the quiet weeks of that winter, entirely his by choice. Toward dawn the baby's fever broke at last, her small body going slack with exhausted, healthy sleep instead of feverish struggle. Doc Fenwick declared her out of danger with the brisk satisfaction of a man who had seen too many such nights end otherwise, and accepted a cup of strong coffee before bundling back into his coat for the ride home now that the worst of the storm had blown itself out. Sarah and Amos were left alone before the hearth where weeks before he had first laid her half-frozen and afraid, both of them hollow-eyed with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "You could have died out there," Sarah said, her voice breaking at last now that the danger had passed and left room for the fear to catch up with her. "Riding into that storm for a child who isn't even yours." "She felt like mine the moment I pulled that shawl back and found her breathing," Amos said quietly. "You both have, if I'm honest, longer than I've let myself admit." He took her hand, work-roughened and trembling still from the long night's fear, and held it as though it were something he had no intention of ever again letting go. "I told myself once that a man who couldn't save his family oughtn't build another. I rode into that storm tonight and understood, somewhere around the 2nd hour, that I wasn't riding to prove I could save you. I was riding because I couldn't imagine a version of my life anymore that didn't have the pair of you in it." "Amos," Sarah said, and could not, for a moment, find any other words at all. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a woman I took in from a storm, and not as help around the kitchen garden either, whatever excuse I gave myself at the start. I'm asking you to be my wife, if you'll have a man who took 6 years to remember how to want a family, and Grace's father in every way that matters, if she'll have me." Sarah's answer came not in words at first, but in the way she leaned into him before the dying fire, her head against his chest where she could hear his heart beating steady and sure, the way it had beaten through every hour of that long, terrible ride into the storm and back. "We were freezing on your porch not 2 months past," she said finally, certain we'd die in the snow with no one in the whole world to notice. I think I'd be a fool to walk away now from the one man who noticed, and rode through a second storm to prove it wasn't only chance. They were married before the last snow melted in a small ceremony at the ranch house, with Doc Fenwick standing as witness and Grace propped on Sarah's hip in a christening gown sewn from the very shawl that had once wrapped her, frozen and afraid, against her mother's chest on a stranger's porch. The neighbors who came, few as they were in that scattered country, remarked afterward that they had never seen Amos Durrell smile so freely, nor so often, and that the ranch house at Cross Timbers, dark and shuttered for so many grieving years, glowed now of an evening with lamplight and laughter both. Sarah kept the old shawl afterward, worn thin as it was, folded in the bottom of the cradle Amos had built, and told Grace, when she was old enough to understand, that it was the very cloth that had first carried her into a stranger's arms, and out of a night that might so easily have ended differently. And the house that had stood cold and silent for 6 long years filled at last, fully and for good, with the warmth of a family built not from what either of them had lost, but from what they had, against every hard odds of that first freezing night, found.